More news, more experience, more often.
This CBS News special report is part of our continuing coverage of the war in the Gulf, with Dan Rather reporting tonight from Saudi Arabia.
The thunder of war sounds on the border as the desert storm threatens to break. Good evening from the war zone. Late reports from all along the front lines indicate that the massive U.S.-led ground war offensive has begun to roll. At the very least, early parts of it are now stabbing into southern Iraq and Kuwait. This is one reason we're on the air at this time. We'll be monitoring the situation throughout this hour. President Bush today brushed off the latest bid by Saddam Hussein for a face-saving way out of Kuwait, so the last deadline is passed, and the next round of the conflict is up to the two huge armies facing each other out there in the dark and in the sand. We go to David Martin at the Pentagon.
Dan, timing is everything, and that is about all that's left here. It's clear that the decision to launch a ground offensive has been made by the president and communicated to the commander in the field, General Norman Schwarzkopf. It is up to him now to decide exactly when and where to strike. I think the element of surprise is basically gone. Saddam Hussein had to know that an attack would come after the noon deadline expired and probably during hours of darkness. And the real question now is exactly where the U.S. is going to strike. Will it be along the border? Will it be along the coast? Will it be behind enemy lines? Will it be all of the above? Will some of those be feints? Those are the kinds of things that are now going to determine how successful this is. Not all the factors are going to be right for this operation. They never are, and it's going to be up to General Schwarzkopf to rely on his 30-plus years of military experience to go when his gut tells him to go. Dan?
CBS News correspondent Eric Ingberg now has the latest from the front.
For the vast American and coalition army, whose weapons make it the most powerful invasion force ever assembled, the withdrawal deadline was barely a blip on schedules filled with preparations for battle. Most had expected it would take foot soldiers and tanks to drive Saddam from Kuwait. Many, including those who will spearhead the invasion, have already gotten their orders and await only the word to go.
Yeah, I'm so excited, I'm shaking now. I want to go do it.
Marine Corps units on the Kuwait border in some of the fiercest fighting of the war took 100 Iraqi prisoners within sight of the more than 200 fires the Iraqis have lit in the oil fields. This is the Ghadar field. Iraq is destroying lives as well as oil fields in Kuwait. The U.S. says it has intelligence that Kuwaitis are being pulled from the streets in roundups, apparently aimed at getting rid of witnesses to earlier atrocities. There's intelligence that Kuwaitis are being pulled from the streets in roundups, apparently aimed at getting rid of witnesses to earlier atrocities. Kuwaitis in exile said these reports, including stories that all adult males in the country are being rounded up, argue for an immediate invasion.
We want it right now because we know our people are suffering.
The U.S. campaign of airstrikes against Iraqi troop positions was intended to diminish Iraq's fighting power. American commanders today report the destruction of 1,625 enemy tanks, or 40%. And the planes kept flying. Eric Ingberg, CBS News, Saudi Arabia.
As the deadline approached, the sirens screamed, and then the skies of Baghdad lit up. The American ultimatum had been ignored by Saddam Hussein. And as the deadline passed, the Allied bombardment continued. But on the streets of Baghdad this afternoon, you couldn't tell that George Bush's deadline was hours away. Iraqi radio was saying Americans will be losers. To Iraqi troops, the radio message was, "You will be winners. This is your day to drive back the infidel." On this day, Iraqis took foreign journalists to see the remains of 2 power plants. The message, "Look what the Allies have done to civilian services." And the question, who is going to pay reparations? While most Iraqis don't know that the deadline has passed, most Iraqis are more than aware of the grim consequences of a ground war. Betsy Aaron, CBS News, Baghdad.
U.S. and allied forces are now reported to be 6 to 12 miles inside Kuwait. They're also inside Iraq. They have moved up against the first Iraqi lines of fortifications in Kuwait. U.S. Marines are already within a mile and a half of a major oil field. This may be the point at which the 2nd Marine Division aims its attack. This is more than reconnaissance, it's reported. These are the positions from which the ground attack will actually be launched, positions inside Kuwait itself. It's also significant, we think, that except for the Marines, guns all along the front have suddenly gone silent. The gunners are waiting for the order for the barrage which will signal the beginning of the all-out ground attack. The essential question of the hour is, has the Iraqi infantry abandoned its first line of defense, except for observation posts, and moved to its second line of defense? The White House watched the deadline pass, then issued a statement of regret and resolve. Wyatt Andrews is at the White House. Wyatt?
Dan, good evening. Diplomacy, such as it was, failed once again today. Nothing that happened, not a rumor of a peace deal at the UN, and not a personal appeal from Mikhail Gorbachev to the president, persuaded Mr. Bush to dilute his ultimatum. Mr. Bush has simply concluded that Iraq is still looking for a deal, when what Mr. Bush wants is for Iraq to publicly accept the ultimatum and throw its troops in reverse in order to prove that. Now, 2 very significant developments today. Mikhail Gorbachev called the president at Camp David and argued on Iraq's behalf for 2 days, delaying the ground war, arguing that in that time maybe Iraq would come around. President Bush said no. Secondly, Mikhail Gorbachev revealed that he had also talked to British Prime Minister Major and also French President Mitterrand to lobby them on behalf of the Soviet peace deal, that they had said no, that they backed the president's plan. Dan, the upshot of all of that is that the president now has unprecedented political power to launch what could be one of history's most bloody ground wars, and that at the end of this intense 3 days of Soviet diplomacy, instead of weakening the president's position, it actually wound up strengthening it, precisely because Gorbachev came up with a plan, shopped it around to the Allies, and failed. Dan?
The deadline came and went, but efforts at diplomacy are continuing and appear to still be underway at this hour, even as the forward elements of the offensive move into Iraq and Kuwait. Bill Plant is at the State Department. Bill?
Dan, on the diplomatic front, there is indeed still a lot of talking, even though there is only the slimmest possible hope of a peaceful settlement. The Secretary of State talked to the Soviet foreign minister again this afternoon. The Soviets were still, according to accounts we received, pushing their peace plan. The U.S. rejected it, but rejected it, going out of its way to praise the Soviets for going to their trouble, to say that this is not a U.S.-Soviet problem. The U.S. still wishes to keep good relations with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council is scheduled to meet later tonight in New York. The session is described, however, by one official as a gum-beating session. There are no resolutions on the table. There is no indication that anything is going to happen at the UN. Another U.S. source says that the members are there because they feel that the war is probably going to start, and they feel that they ought to be involved somehow. So the question, is peace still possible? According to the administration, only on the U.S.-led coalition's terms. And as a practical matter, I suppose, if the Iraqis were suddenly now to announce that they were beginning a massive withdrawal and begin to do it, then the U.S. and the other members of the coalition would find it pretty difficult to continue shooting them in the back, or to begin shooting them in the back if they were leaving. But nobody here expects that to happen. Based on Saddam Hussein's past track record, no one believes that there's much chance left. Dan?
Thanks, Bill. The Soviets had pressed hard for a peaceful solution, and today saw their hopes of that all but disappear. Anthony Mason joins us from Moscow. Anthony?
Dan, for Moscow and especially for President Mikhail Gorbachev, this was a day of great disappointment, as hopes for their peace initiative, which they constructed in a week of intensive negotiations, all but evaporated. The Soviets are still holding out faint hope that their plan and the U.S. plan might be integrated at the United Nations. But when President Gorbachev's request to President Bush to extend the deadline fell on deaf ears, as one Soviet official said somberly, there is little more that we can do. Now, Soviet spokesman Vitaly Ignatyenko insists that U.S.-Soviet relations have not been shaken by their disagreement over the peace initiative. Saddam Hussein, he suggested, had yet another opportunity to end the conflict today, and only he can be blamed if he chooses not to take it. We still hope, Ignatyenko said, that common sense will prevail. Dan?
Thanks, Anthony Mason. As high noon drew near, Saddam Hussein sent the world a signal that he was stiffening his resolve, a Scud missile attack on Israel. Tom Fenton has more from Tel Aviv.
The sirens went off in Tel Aviv just before the deadline and sent Israelis scurrying for their gas masks and into chemical warfare shelter. An 8-ton Scud missile streaked through the sky, breaking up as it re-entered the atmosphere. As far as Israel is concerned, that was Saddam's answer to the American ultimatum. The debris started a fire in a field somewhere in central Israel. There were no buildings nearby and no one was injured. It was a conventional warhead, not the poison gas the Israelis fear Saddam Hussein will use before he surrenders. It was the 38th Scud missile he has hit this country with since the war began.
The only thing that he was able to initiate with some measure of success, at least perceived by his own people and by the Arab masses in the Arab world, was launching Scud missiles.
Israelis tonight were trying to live a normal life despite the Scuds. When an Israeli Philharmonic concert was interrupted by the attack, the orchestra left the stage, the audience donned gas masks, and the guest violinist, Isaac Stern, carried on with a special solo. Israeli officials have been urging the United States to begin the ground war as soon as possible and to pursue it until the end. They want the missile launchers destroyed, the chemical weapons threat eliminated, and the Iraqi war machine crushed. Dan?
Thanks, Tom Fenton. Americans watched the clock tick down today, watched and wondered what happens next. John Blackstone reports on how some on the home front are facing a Gulf War at the crossroad.
Baby, I'm so glad to be living in the USA. Yeah, well, I'm so glad I'm living in the USA.
For many Americans, the idea of war just doesn't seem as terrible as it did little more than a month ago. For the most part, the nation is back to life pretty much as usual. But today, the certainty of fighting on the ground is close to the front of most everybody's mind.
We're going to face a lot of people coming back in body bags.
I mean, nobody wants war, but if they're not going to get out, that's kind of inevitable, isn't it?
In San Francisco in February, people from all over the country come to find some California sunshine. Sharon Ponder is here from Arkansas.
I don't think we should be compromising with him anymore. I think it's too late for that.
John Cathcart is visiting from Atlanta.
So if we don't take a stand and take care of this now, I think we've lost another battle.
Until 2 weeks ago, Lieutenant Tom Fagan was flying patrol missions as a Navy pilot in the Gulf.
Some things you can't question, you just have to do.
CIA, how many kids did you kill today?
It seems fewer people are questioning the war now. A month ago in San Francisco, thousands demonstrated. Today, only a few dozen were on the streets.
I don't know if it's apathy, frustration, a combination. I don't know. I'm here.
Talking to people from all over the country here today, it seems clear that Americans are no longer shocked the nation is at war. Many admit that already the fighting has gone on longer than they'd expected, and with the ground war beginning, there is worry about casualties, but there's no doubt about which side will be victorious. In San Francisco, this is John Blackstone, CBS News. Now back to you, Dan.
Thanks, John. And we'll have much more about what's going on along the front tonight in the Persian Gulf War, including a look at the men and the weapons who will fight the ground offensive with Iraq.
Hard
Hard to believe, but that was me, Dan Deerdorf, before I lost 40 pounds in 4 months with Ultra Slim Fast. Hey, I'm a big eater, but with Ultra Slim Fast, I never felt hungry. The plan is easy. I had a delicious shake for breakfast, another for lunch, and then a sensible dinner. I'm back to my college playing weight, and I feel terrific. Best of all, I'm not shaped like one of these anymore.
Ultra Slim Fast. Give us a week. We'll take off the weight.
Grandma cleaned her dentures with toothpaste. Mom soaked hers with tablets. But I use the denture cleanser of the 90s. Powerful, fast-acting Denture Foam. The deep cleaning of a tablet, the speed of a toothpaste. Just spray it on. In seconds, Denture Foam expands, reaching deep down to loosen even stubborn food stains, so you can quickly brush and rinse your dentures sparkling clean. Total time, just 1 minute. It even has minty mouthwash ingredients. Get new Denture Foam, the deep cleaning of a tablet, the speed of a toothpaste.
A land war will provide the acid test for two theories: Saddam Hussein's idea that America will quit when confronted with heavy casualties, and the U.S. and Allied theory that superior technology, constant pressure, can win the war and keep losses to a minimum. CBS News correspondent Martha Teichner reports on the high-tech ground war.
The multiple launch rocket system pours its steel rain on the Iraqis from 20 miles away. The MLRS is one of the high-tech reasons U.S. commanders believe they can win the ground war with minimum U.S. casualties. Each MLRS rocket can obliterate square blocks, then move on before enemy artillery can target them. High-tech weaponry underscores the basic battle principle that if you can hit the enemy, but he can't hit back, you win. Another key to American hopes is the Apache helicopter. With its night vision and laser targeting capability, the Apache is one more gee-whiz weapon the Iraqis can't match.
The important thing is, you see him first, then you've got the initiative, you've got the advantage over him.
On the ground, the M1A1 tank can see through smoke and darkness and is pressure sealed against chemical contamination. It's got a longer range cannon than the Iraqi Soviet-made tanks. Plus, it's fast, and in this war, fast is expected to make the difference between a decisive, clean win and getting bogged down in the kind of slogging match the Iraqis are good at. That costs lots of lives.
He has up to 10 million to 20 million.
So the Iraqis use mines, lots of them. Mines are intended to slow down the war. Saddam's forces are believed to have laid 2.5 million of them, many with chemicals, that will have to be cleared. Those chemical mines and chemical-laced artillery shells are some of the most fearsome weapons the Iraqis possess. The specter of chemical warfare threatens to undermine the high-tech advantage the Allies take into battle. Ground troops have been told to expect to wear their chemical suits and gas masks for most, if not all, of the push into Kuwait and Iraq. Martha Teichner, CBS News, Tehran.
So far, Saddam Hussein has not used his deadliest force, chemical weapons. Some analysts believe that could change when the war moves to a full ground combat. If Iraq does resort to chemical warfare, how safe are U.S. and other soldiers? To help us try to answer that, Dr. Bob Arnott. Bob?
Hi, Dan. Right now, there are thousands of soldiers at the front in what we would call MOP Level 2, and this is Mission-Oriented Protective Posture 2. What it means is that you will have on your chemical boots like these. Over them you will have a suit, and the suit's made out of charcoal to try and absorb nerve or mustard gas. A jacket, you want it buttoned pretty much all the way up like this. Now what you're waiting for is an alarm. Here is one. This is a chemical detector for nerve, blood, choking agents. And so these are set out at the perimeter, say 500 meters out, or you may even wear one of these. This is a personal one the United States Marines would use. Once that alarm goes off, you do not want to breathe in. You hold your breath, close your eyes, grab your mask like this, you pull it up, put your chin like this, and pull it all the way up over your face. Now, before you take a breath, what you want to do is to put your hand here and underneath here. Push out all of the bad gas. Then hold on here. Take a deep breath through these inlets. That'll seal your mask. At this point, you're protected against any of the chemical or biological weapons that the Iraqis may use. Now, should you have signs or symptoms of nerve gas poisoning, and those might be tearing eyes, shortness of breath, some pressure in your chest, perhaps some diarrhea or vomiting, then what you'll want to do is to inject yourself. You treat yourself here with atropine and 2-PAM. Take this and you put it into your leg like this, hold it for 15 seconds. There are 3 of these to try and treat yourself. Key thing is, this should just be a nuisance and not a weapon that's going to kill a lot of Americans with a proper kind of protection.
This seems very heavy.
It is. You could use up to 7 extra liters of water a day. Very heavy uniforms the United States have. The British have a lighter uniform, a little bit more effective. But the U.S. is used to wearing these, and they feel that they could be very effective, Dan.
Thanks, Dr. Bob Arnold. The Pentagon has promised the ground war will be swift and violent when it comes. Exact details of the battle plan are, of course, secret, but military strategists pretty much know how the war is going to move. Bob Schiefer has a look at the blueprint for battle. Bob?
Dan, as we've been saying all along, this fight is not going to be the charge of the Light Brigade because General Schwarzkopf is not about to send his forces head-on into the strength of Iraq's dug-in army in Kuwait. Instead, the road to Kuwait lies through Iraq itself. Military experts say the Allies will widen the front lines and sweep around Saddam's most heavily fortified defenses, thus avoiding an Iraqi killing field. The officers say another Allied force will encircle the Iraqi army, sealing it off from the rear and denying it supplies and ammunition. At the same time, a large Marine force at sea could help spread confusion with a helicopter assault. It is a strategy aimed at keeping American and Allied casualties low. This CBS News animation of the battlefield shows what it is that awaits the Allied force. There is a deadly obstacle course of oil-filled ditches, which could be set on fire. Barbed wire several layers deep. Mines possibly armed with chemicals, and an Iraqi force armed with tanks and artillery. And to help us understand this, retired Marine Corps General George Christ, who was General Schwarzkopf's predecessor, and an expert on armor, an old tank commander, General Bob Wagner. Let me ask you first, General Christ, the ground war has not officially begun, but analyzing pool reports, other sources of public information, it is absolutely certain that American troops are already on the move.
Oh, we're nigh under there right now. Our forces are up against those first lines of Iraqi defenses. They're cutting through the obstacles, cutting through the minefields. The largest armada since World War II is now bombarding the Kuwaiti coast. Everything is absolutely ready. I suspect all we need is the sound of the guns, Bob.
And let me ask you, General Wagner, will the Iraqi troops be vulnerable to this kind of flanking action that they're talking about?
Absolutely, Bob. As you saw on that very excellent diagram, we are bypassing the majority of their combat power. The defenses are not strong in that sector, and very rapidly we will begin to develop that momentum of attack, what we in the armor community call offensive shock action. Hundreds of tanks on line, shooting, supported by artillery. Very demoralizing.
You're talking about just shutting the door.
Yes, sir.
And they will be cut off. You have been cut off when you were in Vietnam. What is that like, General?
Let's look at it from the perspective of an Iraqi soldier. He's in his knocked-out tank or his knocked-down bunker. He is contemplating suicide. He can never go home again. He has no letters. He has no food. He has no spare parts. He has no ammunition. The only way out of this situation is surrender.
Or die.
Or die.
Well, what about that, General Christ? Do you think these Iraqis are going to put up a fight?
I think it's going to be uneven, Bob. I think the first lines are probably pretty well demoralized in their infantry anyway, and they're not going to hold very well. Now, the second group, which lies maybe 20, 30 miles behind, those are pretty good troops. They may well fight, and certainly the Republican Guard, we don't know. It's a cipher right now. The real problem for them is how well are they going to fight if we come from the rear or their flank, and that I don't know.
How long will it take, General?
This whole thing, it could run from 5 days to 30 days or so.
All right. Back to you, Dan Rather.
Thanks very much, Bob. A late report in from northern Saudi Arabia. The first video of the Gulf War ground fighting has been screened for reporters. Now, under what one can only call the weird rules of this pool arrangement, you aren't allowed to see that video. Some selected reporters have been allowed to see it, but what it shows are bewildered and terrified Iraqi infantrymen shot to pieces in the dark by U.S. Apache attack helicopters. One by one, the Iraqis were cut down in the middle of the night by an enemy they could not see. Some were blown to bits by bursts of exploding cannon shells. Other Iraqis, jarred from sleep and disoriented, fled their bunkers under a literal firestorm of night fighting equipment fired by the Apache helicopters. Bruce Hall is in Fort Rucker, Alabama, for a look at the Apache. Bruce?
And the Apache helicopter, which I'm with right now, is the night-stalking tank killer of the American Army forces. It is the helicopter that will be out front when the forces go into Iraq, and it is the one that will be on the very front line. Here with me is Chief Warrant Officer Bill Murray, who is going to tell us a little bit about this helicopter. Chief Warrant Officer Murray has just returned from Saudi Arabia, and one thing that makes this helicopter very different from any other helicopter is this armament right at the front. Tell us about this.
Okay, Bruce. What we have here are two of the most sophisticated parts on the aircraft. On the top, we have what is called the pilot night vision sensor. This is the device that allows the pilot to see outside at night and fly the aircraft. Underneath it, we have what is called the co-pilot's TADS. It's used by the co-pilot gunner to first acquire targets, and then once he finds those targets, he can use it to engage the targets.
In many ways, this is almost like a big video game that you have here, all of the material, and this makes it a very sophisticated helicopter.
As a matter of fact, that's exactly right. The better you are at playing video games, the better you can operate this system.
But it has more than video games aboard. This helicopter has a lot of armament. Tell us about this particular piece here.
All right, this is what is called the 30mm chain gun. It's an area fire weapon system that would be used primarily to protect the crew, and it can be activated and fired by either the co-pilot or the pilot.
How many shots?
The gun fires 600 to 650 rounds a minute, and it carries 1,200 rounds.
So it has a lot of firepower there. But this helicopter, which is really now the mainstay for the troops in the front, has a lot more firepower too. Among them, the Hellfire missiles. Tell us about the Hellfire.
Right. This is what the Apache helicopter is all about. The Hellfire missile is a very accurate laser-guided weapon that is used primarily to kill tanks.
And also aboard this helicopter, which has a lot of armament, is prepared for anything.
Bruce Hall.
Okay.
Bruce Hall, it's Dan Rather in Saudi Arabia. Bruce? Forgive me, Bruce Hall. It's Dan Rather in Saudi Arabia. We have breaking developments. David Martin at the Pentagon has news from the front. David?
Dan, we have now several reports from different sources that U.S. ground forces are, as you reported earlier, inside Iraq and Kuwait in what is to be called, I think, the opening wave of this ground offensive, and probably the most crucial wave, because it's during these first couple hours that the Iraqis who choose to resist will probably have their only chance to fire off whatever chemical weapons they still have left after this more than 1 month of aerial bombardment. So I think right now we are witnessing what may turn out to be the most crucial moments of a ground war, which apparently is just in its very opening phases.
David, we just had this report from the reporters who saw the Apache helicopter night attack with Iraqis breaking and running. We want to explain the footage was shot through powerful night vision gun sights that turn pitch night into ghostly day. It's one reason that the attack, of course, is being launched at night, is because the United States feels it has such an advantage over the Iraqis in night fighting. David, General Schwarzkopf and others in the U.S. command seem to have been saying in the last few days that they wanted to tighten the vice just as hard as they could on Iraq's frontline troops, obviously to get them to cave in.
Well, and I think the hope is that there is going to be mass surrenders, and there is one report from a source here in Washington that they are starting to take large numbers of surrendering Iraqi prisoners of war. If all goes well, that will be the trend throughout the ground phase of this campaign. I think the vice may have been had a slight interruption in it because of these reports of atrocities being committed in Kuwait City. It will be weeks probably before we know all the details of how this operation unfolded in the final hours. But it seems to me quite likely that
Perhaps the U.S. went sooner than it had originally planned because of these reports of atrocities in Kuwait and the realization that if they did not get on with the liberation of Kuwait, there would not be much left to liberate.
David, it's always difficult to tell in the early stages of a massive ground offensive. It was at D-Day, it was with the Tet Offensive, it was with the Incheon landing in Korea. Do you feel comfortable in reporting now that the ground war offensive has started?
I do, Dan. I am not sure that the all-out go for what has frequently been called the largest cavalry charge in history, at least around here. I am not sure that has been given for multiple divisions to go across the border and deep into Iraq. But I am confident now that the opening phases of the ground war are underway with American troops back inside on the ground in Kuwait, there to stay until Kuwait is liberated.
U.S. Marines, we know, are already inside Kuwait. We reported that earlier. If you look at the map, think of the Persian Gulf off to the right. The Marines are closest to the Gulf. They've moved up inside Kuwait there. Right next to them is the U.S. Army 1st Cavalry Division, along with the Arab forces, the so-called Pan-Arab forces. They, David, are operating inside Kuwait. What we don't know about, if you then see the Kuwaiti border, it's the Persian Gulf with the Marines, then the 1st Cav and the Arab forces to their left flank, and to their left, facing southern Iraq, would be the 7th Corps, U.S. Army 7th Corps, including the 1st Infantry, the 3rd and 1st Armored, and the 24th Mechanized Infantry. I want to make sure I understand, David, what you're saying is that that sweeping main attack flanking force may not have yet been launched.
I do not know that that has been launched yet, Dan. That's correct.
Right. Now, some Allied ground forces have been on forays into Kuwait for several days. Troops getting their first taste of ground battle. But before, we were going to go to a Peter Van Sant report, but right now let's go to Bill Plant at the State Department with a late development. Bill?
Dan, we understand that the president will return to Washington from Camp David tonight and probably is expected to address the American people sometime this evening, I think within the next couple of hours. It would be, of course, to signal the beginning of this ground offensive, which has been widely reported, seems now to be underway. So repeating that, we expect the president to return from Camp David, according to a couple of sources, to come back to the White House and to address the American people tonight on television. Dan?
Thanks, Bill. And David Martin, if you're still standing by there at the Pentagon, that would be a further indication of what you've been reporting over these last few minutes, that there can no longer be any doubt that the U.S. and Allied ground offensive is underway.
That's right, Dan. I think we can be certain of that now. There are going to be a lot of details that come out, and probably at this stage, even if we knew the details, it wouldn't be wise to help Saddam Hussein try and figure out how he's going to deal with what is surely going to be a massive assault on the ground.
We want to pause. Thank you, David. We want to pause now in our CBS News coverage, which started out to be an hour special report. We want to give an opportunity for our stations across the country to join us now that our early reports of the ground offensive starting have, in effect, been confirmed, and we know the president is heading back to the White House. So we're going to take a slight pause here to let some of our stations across the country join us at this point. Stick in here with us.
This CBS News special report will continue. As part of our continuing coverage of the war in the Gulf, with Dan Rather reporting tonight from Saudi Arabia.
Storyline of the hour. The U.S.-led ground offensive against Iraqi forces in Kuwait is underway. It's been underway for some hours. The sequence of events. President Bush had set a deadline of today, noon, Eastern Time in the United States, for Saddam Hussein to do two things. One, to publicly announce that he was pulling his troops out of Kuwait, and two, to actually begin pulling his troops out. Under President Bush's proposal, all of the troops of Iraq, or at least the vast majority of them, would have had to have been out in a week. The Iraqis did not respond positively to that. In the hours after that, the White House made it clear that the president had set his deadline, the deadline had passed, the time for dealing was done. Then CBS News began getting these reports of cross-border forays picking up, especially inside Kuwait. And tonight it became clear, with David Martin reporting to the Pentagon, that the ground offensive is underway. Let's go back to David Martin at the U.S. Defense Department along the Potomac. David?
Dan, we now have reports that the amphibious portion of this operation has begun to swing into operation. Reports that the amphibious ships, there are 31 amphibious ships in the Gulf carrying about 17,000 Marines. They are now reported to be moving into position. Now, we have to remember, not all of these moves may be anything more than feints. And there are a lot of people who will tell you that an amphibious landing against the kind of defenses that the Iraqis have built up along the Kuwait coast is a very difficult operation. It may well be that the amphibious operation or any of the other maneuvers that we are reporting now and will be reporting during the course of the night, it may well be that they turn out to be feints designed to hold Iraqi forces in position so that the real thrust of the attack can go forward. But we have this report that amphibious forces have now begun to move into position.
Thanks. Let's go to retired U.S. Marine General George Crist, who until fairly recently commanded U.S. forces in this part of the world. General Crist, if we can get you at the map, I think it's time for us to pause and again review what the Allied ground offensive is envisioned to entail once all of it gets rolling. We now know that we have the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions moving into Kuwait onshore. David Martin just reported that the first elements of the amphibious attack from the sea is either underway, or could it be, General Crist, that this is part of a huge feint while ground forces farther to the west along the Kuwaiti and Iraqi borders begin to move?
Well, Dan, we don't exactly know, of course. We do know that the bombardments for preliminary for an amphibious operation have already begun along the coast, and the amphibious force is there. That could, of course, be either one. It could be to hold the forces here or to make an amphibious operation, and I think it's a little unclear yet how that will develop. Along the lines, you see the red lines, the Allied and coalition forces already closed on those lines.
General Crist, if you'll forgive me for just a moment, sirens are sounding here in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, the indication that a Scud alert is underway here now. U.S. forces at this huge...
Well, the sirens have gone off in Dhahran, as you just heard Dan Rather announce what had happened. What often happens when those sirens go off is that we lose communication. The electricity goes out, as it were, and the satellites go down. That's apparently what has just happened. I'm told, Dan, you're back on the air. Can you hear me?
Yes, Bob, I do. We occasionally lose power at the beginning of one of these Scud alerts, and that's what happened here. Now, we've had several Scud alerts in recent days. In one case, a Scud was knocked out of the sky by a Patriot missile not far from here. The Scud aimed at, it turned out, at Bahrain. Several of the Scuds have been knocked out just north of here in the last couple of days. Now, as the various air raid shelters are beginning to fill up here, and while we take the precautions that we're required to take as people who intend to continue broadcasting here during this Scud alert, and while we look out to see if any Patriots are fired, let's go to Wyatt Andrews at the White House. Wyatt?
Dan, the development here is that President Bush, within just the next few minutes, will get back on his helicopter and return to the White House from Camp David, where we are told he will deliver a message to the American people. He is expected about 9:30 Eastern Time to land at the White House, and at about 10 p.m. Eastern Time will have a message for, again, the American people. This is new because we had not expected any sort of presidential announcement. The White House, for the last hour or two, I should report, has been abuzz with high-level officials. John Sununu, the Chief of Staff, is here. The two top national security advisors to the President, General Brent Scowcroft and Bob Gates, are also here. The White House press office is gearing up. Very unusual, obviously, for a Saturday night, but obviously connected to an announcement and an explanation of why the ground war is beginning and why the president believes that diplomacy can go nowhere. Dan?
The sounds of war here in Saudi Arabia, warplanes taking off, heading for Kuwait and possibly southern Iraq, and in the background, the sirens of a Scud alert continue to sound. We've had our eye out for any Patriot missiles firing at Scuds. So far as we can make out, none have been fired yet. So let's take a breath, report that the major ground offensive that has been anticipated for so long is in its early stages now on this Saturday night. And General George Christ, as the Scud alert first sounded, was in the process of explaining to us what the overall tactics and strategy are expected to be. So General Christ, if we can try to pick up again, we perhaps ought to emphasize that David Martin did report from the Pentagon that the amphibious assault coming in from the sea was either starting or at the very least a major effort was being made at a feint for an amphibious operation.
Exactly right, Dan. Just starting from the Persian Gulf and then moving across. The amphibious forces are here. Bombardment has been going on all day, either preliminary to an actual landing or to a demonstration to hold the forces down. Along the marine area, the Marines are already up on the fortifications, and in fact they're very close in, about 12 miles in here. The same is true of the coalition forces, which are up along the line, cutting the minefields and the obstacles right up on the Iraqi fortifications. The main attack, of course, is expected further over here to the west. We don't know anything about that yet, whether that is going in, but we do expect that sometime in the course of this operation, these forces are going to crack loose, cut north, and seal off the Republican Guards up here to the north, and cut this army loose and off from everything to the north, isolating it on the battlefield.
General Chris, I think people want to know where their sons and daughters are. So very quickly, could you point on the map where the 82nd and 101st Airborne, where they're located?
Well, I can't give exact positions, Dan, as you well know, but they are in the west right now, and I believe they're preparing for action.
And then where would the 1st Armored, the 3rd Armored, the 24th Mechanized Infantry, and the 1st Infantry be?
Our heavy armor 7th Corps is sitting, Dan, right about here in the west, in this general area, and they, of course, will take the great armored attack to the north.
And that would be the main attack under the strategy as we understand it.
That is correct. That is the one that's going to sweep around the flank of the Iraqi army, engage the armor if it decides to come out, cut them off, and then seal the entire operation.
And the 1st Cavalry Division operating with the Arab forces, you want to point where they are on the map?
They're down in this area down here, and we do expect that the Arab forces, which are located along here, will indeed make some attacks north. Now, those are not main attacks, Dan. Those are what are known as secondary attacks. However, any secondary attack may achieve success on the battlefield. It could cut through those lines, and one always reinforces to success. So those forces will indeed be engaged very soon.
And on their right flank, the 2nd Marine Division and then the 1st Marine Division.
That's right. The 2nd Marine Division is in this area here, just around the boot of Kuwait, and the 1st Marine Division leads to the sea here. And we expect the 2nd Division to probably attack up in this direction toward Kuwait City, and the 1st Division in this area. But again, they're not going to try to cut through these lines and take heavy casualties, but it may be that these fellows are going to surrender. We've seen it today where, stripped of their tanks, 83 prisoners came across to the Marines. So this could happen again and again and again as this attack goes on.
General, we reported that the Marines are already inside Kuwait, some 6 to 18 miles. Just point on the area on the map there where, generally, where they're known to be operating.
They're right in here, Dan. You see the blue arrow on the map. This is the Gadir field. These red lines are the defensive lines, and the Marines are, in fact, right on those defensive lines, if not through them. That's not clear, but they certainly were engaged right on those defensive lines within about 1.5 miles of that oil field.
I want to point out, for those who are just joining us in progress, that the President of the United States is expected to address the nation at 10 o'clock tonight. That would be Eastern Time. and that there is a Scud alert underway here in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. We've heard no Patriots being fired as yet. Air raid sirens are also sounding in Riyadh. Now, there has been a school of thought that says that Saddam Hussein's Scud launchers had been moved north of Baghdad, making it very difficult, if not impossible, for the Scuds to reach either Riyadh or down here to Dhahran. But that was never confirmed, and we had already had a Scud attack in Israel earlier today with no damage and no casualties reported. So that's just to bring you up to date. General Chris, we'll get back to you later. Thanks for pointing out where the various elements are there on the map. Joining us now from Washington are Congressman Lee Hamilton, a Democrat, and Republican Senator Orrin Hatch. Thanks for being with us, gentlemen. First, Congressman Hamilton, your reaction at the ground war offensive getting started.
Well, my reaction is that the Congress, the American people now, will put aside any questions we might have had about the timing of that ground war, fully support it, and hope and pray that it is successful, and successful very quickly, with minimum casualties.
Senator Hatch, your reaction.
Well, we knew it was going to happen. I thought it would happen within 24 hours after the 12 noon deadline. It's time that it did. General Powell made it very clear that, you know, there's a point of diminishing returns in just an air war. If you want to end the war quickly, you're going to have to hit them psychologically and hit them hard, and hopefully we can end this war and interdict this man and stop this man from having access to weapons of mass destruction such as nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, plus stop him from sponsoring terrorism all over the world.
Congressman Hamilton, you had been talking about the need for prudence and caution in the last hours of negotiation. On the record that you know of, did President Bush go far enough with prudence and caution, or would you have liked to have seen him go even further?
I think the President's initiative, his proposal, in which he gave an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein, was appropriate. It was appropriate because he stayed very carefully within the guidelines of the United Nations resolutions. He stayed within the framework of the coalition partners. It was a tough ultimatum, and I think appropriate. But that's behind us now. The Iraqis did not accept that proposal, and we have an altogether different situation. It is worth pointing out, however, that remarkable progress was made in a period of about 24, 48 hours on the diplomatic side. And we ought not to forget that as we look at all these pictures of the war. And that progress was, it seems to me, changed the whole question. The question was whether or not Saddam Hussein was going to stay in Kuwait. Now the question is, how does he get out?
Senator Hatch, to those who were saying, and some who may still be saying, listen, that last offer by the Iraqis given by Tariq Aziz, in which he seemed to be saying, well, we'll be out within 21 days, wasn't all that unreasonable. Why pull the trigger tonight, as the trigger has obviously been pulled?
Well, there were at least 4 reasons why the President had to reject that. Keep in mind, we've been using diplomacy for months now, ever since August 2nd. And there have been tremendous achievements, and it now looks like they're starting to break. But there were 4 reasons why the President rejected that. Number one, the 21 days was too long. They could get all of their equipment out. 7 days that the President offered them was reasonable. Number two, the reason that Saddam Hussein did not want to agree with the Security Council resolutions and wanted those lifted is because, number one, he doesn't want to recognize the legitimate government of Kuwait, and number two, he doesn't want to make reparations for the damage he's caused. Number three, if we cease fire, that means that we would be subjecting our young men and women to barrages. It would be very difficult to start it up again, so we couldn't very well cease fire, but we were going to allow them to retreat without any attacks from us if they had accepted the President. And number four, we could not lift the sanctions in accordance with what Saddam Hussein wanted, because we needed those sanctions in order to keep him into a posture where we would have to negotiate away his right to develop nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons and sponsor state-sponsored terrorism all over the world. So the President was not only right, he diplomatically did everything he possibly could have done, and it's time now to put this man in his place, stop him. Diplomacy beyond this, I think, would be to the detriment of our young men and women over there, to the detriment of of Israel and, of course, the whole Middle East, and it's still going to go on regardless, and we may still effectuate diplomatic turns that could end the war in a way that all of us would be happy with.
Thank you very much, Senator Hatch and Congressman Hamilton. Let's go to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the capital of the country, where Susan Spencer is or has been under Scud alert. Susan?
Dan, we still are. The sirens are still going on. We heard an explosion of some sort about 5 minutes ago, but we haven't been able yet to verify whether or not that was a Patriot intercepting a Scud or what it was. The people who could verify that for us, the Joint Information Bureau people, are themselves in the shelter right now, so at the moment we can't really give you much more information.
Thanks, Susan. And here in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, the all clear has just sounded after an earlier Scud alert, which came on while we were on the air. We don't know whether any Patriots were fired. We don't know whether the Scuds, at what the Scuds were fired. As the evening goes along, we'll probably be finding that out. With the ground war offensive now underway, President Bush preparing to address the nation at 10 o'clock Eastern Time tonight. We're going to pause for a moment, but tell you that our coverage will continue after these messages.
Don't. Regular Rolaids uses an aluminum salt. This uses aluminum and magnesium. So does this. Of all these, only Tums helps wipe out heartburn and gives you calcium you need every day.
Something my body needs anyway. I like that.
Calcium-rich Tums. That's the one you want.
When you rinse first with Plax, normal everyday brushing takes on a whole...
Learn that your pain reliever may contain...
proven to remove more plaque than brushing alone.
If you're like a lot of people, you're probably trying to cut back on caffeine. You certainly don't want to find it in unexpected places. So you might be surprised to learn that your pain reliever may contain caffeine. Check the label. There is no caffeine in Tylenol. With Tylenol, all you get is fast, effective relief without caffeine. And you should know that hospitals use Tylenol nearly 5 times more than all other pain relievers combined. Tylenol, the pain reliever hospitals use most.
When you're cooking your best, nothing tastes quite like butter. Nothing bastes quite like butter. Nothing bakes quite like butter.
Butter.
Butter! When you're cooking your best, nothing tastes quite like butter.
When the war is over and Kuwait is liberated, then what? Were they really worth fighting for? That's what Steve Kroft went to find out at their capital in exile. 60 Minutes, Sunday.
His brother's killer has returned. Central City belongs to me. Forcing the Flash to run where no man has run before. Into the future.
2001.
At a special day and time.
I'm not the Flash anymore. I've lost it.
The Flash, Wednesday at 8.
Finally, a perspective on how it really feels to do cocaine. From the inside.
So, not having to wait anymore.
No. Back at Saudi Arabia, live from Saudi Arabia, Dan Rather with the CBS News team reporting on the fact that the ground offensive has begun. It started tonight. President Bush is coming back to the White House and will be addressing the nation in, about an hour. He's due to address the nation at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. Now, the situation on the battlefront itself appears to be as follows, and we're going to try to use our makeshift map here. That what we know is that the U.S. Marine 1st and 2nd Divisions, this is Kuwait, this is Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf. The U.S. Marine 1st and 2nd Divisions are right up here, tucked along the coast, and they have gone some 6 to 16 miles into Kuwait itself. The U.S. Army 1st Cav, along with some of the Arab forces, including Saudi Arabian forces and Egyptian forces, are right up here, sort of where Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia come together. They also have been making some cross-border forays. Now, the U.S. Army forces are stretched, the 7th Corps, stretched in this area facing Iraq. Whether they have started to make any serious forays into Iraq, southern Iraq yet, we do not know. Keep in mind that the main force flanking action, the main thrust against Saddam Hussein's forces, is expected to go through here to southern Iraq. The whole idea is to cut off these well-dug-in Iraqi forces in here. And when General Colin Powell said, we intend to cut them off and then kill them, what he meant was a big sweeping flanking motion here. This is Basra right in here. Now the Euphrates River, roughly up in this area, this would be the target of this U.S. 7th Corps making this slashing motion up through here, going in that direction to cut them off. Even farther to the west, the 101st Airborne, the 82nd Airborne, they would also have the job, if the signal is actually given, of running their stab in and going all the way to the Euphrates River. That in rough form has been the battle plan. Now, there were thunderous artillery duels all across, along that border last night, and CBS News correspondent Peter Van Sant is just back with the first of the battle reports.
Stand by! Fire!
Throughout the night, artillery units from the 2nd Marine Division blasted enemy positions inside Kuwait, supporting Marines fighting Iraqi troops near the Qudar oil field, not far from the Saudi Arabian border. The small unit of Marines has been battling Iraqi troops for more than 2 days. A military spokesman says as many as 100 Iraqis have been killed in the fighting, with an equal number taken prisoner.
Preliminary indications are we've damaged 18 tanks, 11 of them by Marine air, 7 of them by direct fire conventional weapons.
Besides artillery lighting up the night sky, much of southern Kuwait appeared to be on fire overnight as dozens of oil wells, apparently torched by Iraqi troops, burned out of control. In what is being described as a scorched earth tactic, the massive fires are sending huge clouds of smoke across much of southern Kuwait and parts of Saudi Arabia, obscuring visibility which could hamper military operations.
As with any chemical burning like that, there's always the problem of those type of noxious gases and pollutants in the air that we may have to deal with. There could be some extreme heat that we'll have to avoid coming in proximity to those fires.
From our base, there is a constant drum roll of artillery and bombs striking Iraqi positions. All along the front lines, the mobilization for battle is picking up momentum. A Marine patrol here made a disturbing discovery, coming across traces of a chemical agent near an Iraqi position. If there is war, these men will go into battle wearing their chemical suits. Peter Van Sant, CBS News, with the 2nd Marine Division.
The ground war has begun. Here are some of the headlines. The first wave of Allied forces has crossed into Kuwait in at least 2 separate sections. Amphibious assault may also be underway, although there is a school of thought that the amphibious assault may turn out to be a feint. We simply don't know about that. President Bush will address the nation later tonight around 10 o'clock Eastern Time. David Martin at the Pentagon reports troops are up to 8 miles inside Kuwait in one place. We also have a report that some of the Marine forces are as much as 16 miles into Kuwait. I want to point out that it could take 48 hours or more to develop the full offensive. Throughout the day and night, U.S. and other Allied troops have probed into enemy territory to clear a path for the main thrust of the ground offensive. There are also indications of an amphibious assault. Some 17,000 Marines are said to be moving into position, but it's not clear yet if that's to be an attack or a diversion for the Iraqi troops. We feel we can't point that out often enough. President Bush was at Camp David during the day when the deadline, 12 noon Eastern Time, passed for Saddam Hussein's troops to begin getting out of Kuwait. The president is now on his way back to the White House from Camp David. The indications are at the White House that he will be speaking to the nation about the beginning of the ground war, which is now underway. Let's go to David Martin at the Pentagon. David?
Dan, an official who has been watching our coverage and heard me report that some of the Iraqi troops are beginning to surrender called me to caution me, not that that was incorrect, but that not to take much heart in the fact that these frontline troops may be surrendering. The heart of the Iraqi army is the Republican Guards. They are behind, way behind all these forces that are being attacked now. They're back in Iraq proper, just south of the city of Basra, and they are the ones that are going to have the greatest capability to kill young Americans that are going into battle tonight. But we should, I suppose, take some pleasure in the predicament that these Republican guards face. They have spent the last 38 days being bombed almost daily. Now they know that an attack has begun. They don't know exactly what direction it's coming from, but they know that if they come out of their fortifications and start to maneuver, they are going to expose themselves to airstrikes. Because remember, we've been talking about the ground offensive, but all this ground maneuver is being done under the cover of Allied air forces.
Let's go to Wyatt Andrews at the White House. Wyatt?
Dan, we believe that the president will be speaking to the nation tonight. We don't know exactly from where, from what point, whether it will be a press conference or simply a statement, a speech from the Oval Office. But we do know that he any minute now will leave what began to look like a long weekend at Camp David. Will helicopter back to the White House. It's expected to land here in about 30 minutes, 9:30 Eastern Time. And again, we'll probably, we're a little sketchy on this, address the nation in some form or another at 10 Eastern Time. Unusually for a Saturday night, the White House began to get to work in earnest around here. Several of the president's top advisors have been at work for at least the last couple of hours. His chief of staff, John Sununu, his two top national security advisors, Brent